Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Oath or affirmation, announcements by the President.
Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator Anita Haynes, who is ill. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from Her Excellency the President Paula May Weeks, ORTT. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago by Her Excellency Paula May Weeks, ORTT, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. To Mr. Robert LeHunt, whereas by the provisions of Section 3, 9, and 43(2)(e) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the President, in exercise of the power vested in her and acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, is empowered to declare the seat of a senator to be vacant. Now, therefore, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, in exercise of the power vested in me by the said Section 43(2)(e) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby declare the seat of you, Robert LeHunt, to be vacant with effect from the 18th of May, 2020. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President St. Anne's, this 18th day of May, 2020. Appointment of a Senator by Her Excellency Paula May Weeks, ORTT, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. To Mr. Jason Williams, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 42(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, do hereby appoint you, Jason Williams, a Senator with effect from the 18th of May, 2020. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President St. Anne's, this 18th day of May, 2020. Honorable Senators, a Senator is required to take the oath.
I, Jason Williams, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Honourable Senators, I am awaiting an instrument from Her Excellency so that, with your leave, we will revert to this item on the order paper once I'm in receipt of same.
Papers.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I'm so happy to be back in the chamber today. Before I start, I think it may be opportune if I, stepping out of my crease a little, to congratulate our new senator, Senator Jason Williams. Madam President, I have the honor to lay the following paper as listed on the order paper in the name of the Minister of Health. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Health to the 15th report of the Joint Select Committee on Human Rights, Equality and Diversity on the current provisions for the special education of children who require special education programs and services in public primary and secondary schools.
Reports from committees, urgent questions.
Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I crave your indulgence to ask that questions 1 and 2 to the Minister of Finance be deferred to later in the proceeding. He will be personally coming here to answer them, and we will be obviously answering question number 3 at this point in time.
So questions 1 and 2 are deferred until later in the proceedings. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Attorney General, in light of a request to the Chief Justice by the Assembly of Southern Lawyers, can the Attorney General advise as to the time frame for the reopening of the courts of Trinidad and Tobago?
Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, the question as posed is entirely wrong and a misrepresentation of the letter from the Assembly of Southern Lawyers, which I have in my possession. They have never asked as to the reopening of courts because the courts are in fact open. In fact, I can tell you, Madam President, we have had over 5,832 matters heard in court in the period March 16th to May 13th, including 1,450 matters heard directly at the prisons as a result of virtual hearings, courtesy this government's drive to open courts in the prisons. I reject Senator Mark's attempt to misconstrue the letter written by the Assembly of Southern Lawyers because it is in fact not correct.
Can the Attorney General now indicate to this Honourable Senate when will the courts of Trinidad and Tobago be officially reopened for the public, lawyers, and accused to go directly before judges and not virtually?
Attorney General.
Madam President, I'm again astounded at the misrepresentation by Senator Mark. The courts are open. They could not be open and have 5,832 matters passing through them. This is just a gross misrepresentation of the position, and I want to reject out of hand the attempt to make false allegations, not only of the Assembly of Southern Lawyers, but that the courts are closed. That is just not true.
Senator Mark.
Thank you for guiding me. Madam President, I think the 2 other questions are going to be deferred.
Yes, you have no further supplemental. Okay.
Questions on notice, questions for oral answer.
Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, the government will be answering questions 72, 94 and 95, and we ask for a deferral of 2 weeks for question number 96.
Question number 96 is deferred for 2 weeks. Senator Mark.
Thank you. Question number 94 to the Prime Minister.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, this question is based on a false premise. The official residence of the Prime Minister in Tobago was not repaired. The old building on the site was not maintained, in particular over the 2010 to 2015 period, and was in such a state of disrepair that it had to be demolished and rebuilt. The question of an increase in costs of repairs, therefore, does not arise. The scope of works related to the project involved the following: demolition of the existing structure, design and build of the Prime Minister's residence, addition of a visitor's car park, restoration and upgrade of the access road with improved drainage, and the demolition of the existing security building on approach to the residence.
Senator Mark.
Can I ask the Honourable Leader of Government Business, given all the areas outlined, can he indicate to the Senate what was the cost? What was the cost of the original estimated cost, rather, that is, for this whole renovation, literally rebuilding of the Prime Minister's residence in Tobago?
Minister.
Well, I'm glad he corrected himself. It wasn't a renovation, it was the construction of an entire new building and residence with all the related infrastructure. The actual cost was $17.5 million.
Can the Honourable Minister indicate what was the original cost of that project?
The information,
Talk about the actual cost.
the information before me is the actual cost, and this is what I shared with the Parliament.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, can the Minister indicate what was the period of time it took for this project to be completed? Can you share that with the Parliament?
Senator Mark, that question does not arise. Next question.
Okay. Can I go on?
Yes.
Question number 94 to the Minister of Finance.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Madam President, for the period December 2018 to May 2019, Parlia Fuel Trading Limited sourced its forex internally or through the commercial banks. As Parlia was experiencing difficulties in obtaining the volumes of foreign exchange required for its operations, the government granted Parlia access to the US dollar foreign exchange facility at the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. For the period June 2019 to January 2020, Parlia used the facility to access US $69 million to cover the shortfall in foreign exchange needed for the procurement of fuel supplies for the local fuel market. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, can the Minister indicate whether Parlia is literally dependent on the Treasury, through the Central Bank, I should say, for support as it relates to foreign exchange? Is that what Parlia is now using, exchange US dollars at the Central Bank to make up for its shortfall?
Minister.
Madam President, as I indicated, during the initial portion of Parlia's operations, they were self-sufficient in respect of foreign exchange, but from May of 2019, they had a difficulty sourcing the foreign exchange, and this is why the Minister of Finance gave them access to the facility at the Central Bank.
Senator Mark.
Can the Honourable Minister, through you, Madam President, indicate whether Parlia is in a position now to generate its own foreign exchange? Minister.
Madam President, as we know, Parlia is in the business of trading in energy products, and its foreign exchange needs vary depending on the price of energy products at any particular time. So at some points it will be self-sufficient, and at other times it may need the support of government to access foreign exchange.
Senator Mark.
So, Madam President, can the minister indicate whether PARIA essentially is a loss-making entity at this point in time in its ability and capacity to earn foreign exchange for the people of Trinidad and Tobago? Can the Honourable Minister clear the air on that?
Senator Mark, I won't allow that question. Next question. Next question, Senator Mark.
Yes, question 95 to the Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, in response to Roman 1, the amount of natural gas that is expected to be supplied to the plant in Pointe-à-Pierre is approximately 31 million standard cubic feet per day. Question Roman 2, the Trinidad and Tobago Upstream Downstream Energy Operations Company Limited is bound by confidentiality provisions in its gas sales contract with NICON, which precludes the disclosure of the commercial terms of these contracts. And that has been an ongoing exercise. Questions come to ask those to give us the commercial details, and obviously we can't. And in response to Roman 3, the estimated date of commencement of commercial operations at this point in time is 30th of August 2020.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, given the crisis on the estate with new prices for the supply of natural gas, can the minister indicate whether NICON, as a new entity, would be in a position to sustain those new increases?
Minister.
A gas sales contract was concluded between Trinidad and Tobago Upstream Downstream Energy Company Limited and NICON. At this point in time, that question is more appropriately put to NICON.
Can the Honourable Minister indicate to us, Madam President, whether he can share with us the period of this contract?
Minister.
I can't recall the, but I don't want to be quoted, but I can get that information, but it is well beyond 10 years.
Senator Mark. That's it? Okay.
Public business, government business, bills, second reading.
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Animals, Diseases and Importation Act, Chapter 6702, be now read a second time. Madam President, we have in this House dealt with a number of bills related to crime and crime fighting, and a number of bills related to financial measures, including compliance with CFATF and FATF and other global requirements. Madam President, this bill seeks to ensure that our 65-year-old Animal Diseases and Importation Act is updated in accordance with what is expected of Trinidad and Tobago trading in the global environment in meat products, and animals. Madam President, this is an important time for a debate like this. As I get into the bill itself, I'll point out some of the language and how it relates to what is happening in our environment today. Madam President, this bill is 37 clauses, and the architecture of the bill is that there are 19 existing sections of the legislation which we seek to amend. So there are 19 proposals for amending existing sections of the existing law. There are 9 new sections being proposed, Madam President, and towards the end of the bill, from clauses 33 to 37, there are some other amendments that are proposed. In relation to the 9 new sections, Madam President, I want to point out right away that these new 9 sections are as follows. It is proposed via Clause 8 that new sections A to F, 3A to F be introduced, and those deal with the powers of the inspector under the current legislation and the expansion of those powers. Clause 11 proposes the introduction of new sections 5A to J, and those deal at the heart of what is proposed in this bill with the introduction of an animal disease surveillance system. Clause 15, Madam President, proposes the introduction of a new section 8A, and that deals with control measures. Clause 21 proposes the introduction of a section 15A, and that deals with international transport facility. 5, Clause 23 proposes the introduction of new sections 16A to 16F, and very importantly, those deal with import restrictions. The 6th insertion that is proposed, Madam President, is via Clause 26. Very, very important and very topical in our country. That, Madam President, represents the most significant effort in the last 65 years to amend our legislation dealing with the issue of animal welfare. So Clause 26 proposes, Madam President, the insertion of new sections 18A to 18L. The 7th new section that is proposed, Madam President, is via Clause 27, with the introduction of 20A and 20B to deal with the treatment of seized animals. The 8th proposal for the insertion of new sections is found via Clause 29, and it's proposed to insert Clause 21A to 21H, and very importantly, Madam President, those deal with offenses, including offenses related to the mistreatment, cruelty to animals. And finally, Madam President, the new insertions being proposed, the 9th one, is via Clause 31, the proposal to insert a new section 23A, which gives the Minister the important power to amend schedules as required. And a critical part of that power, Madam President, you would see in the bill itself, proposal to amend the existing schedules. And when you deal, Madam President, with this issue of animal diseases, for example, you would see that the governing body, the WHO for animals, Madam President, is called the OIE, the International Organization for Animal Health, and there are many references in the bill to that. And the OIE, in the same way the WHO does in relation to human health, the OIE is constantly taking note of what is happening in the world, and in particular, updating this list of infectious diseases relating to animals. And the proposal to give the Minister the power via the new Section 23A that is proposed is simply a proposal to allow the Minister to amend the schedule from time to time. Madam President, I would take the House through the Act by highlighting 10 critical areas of the bill, starting with what appears to be a very innocuous provision, which is at clause 1 and 2. And that is, Madam President, so I would identify 10 areas, starting with number 1. The long and short title of the Act, the proposal is to amend that. And as simple as it is, Madam President, and I'm referring to clauses 4 and 5 of the bill, as simple as it is, it seeks to introduce the words animal health and welfare in the existing legislation. And that is important because, as I've said, in the 65-year history of this legislation, it's the first time we are making a significant attempt to deal with the issue of animal welfare. And Madam President, we do that in 2 ways, and I will highlight them later on. Suffice it to say at this stage, we do it by introducing new animal welfare provisions, and secondly, we do it by expanding the powers of the minister to make regulations, and by specifying in those powers, the minister may make regulations dealing with animal health and welfare standards. And that is how we expand this existing legislation to cover the important area of animal health and welfare standards. The second part of the bill, and is very critical, Madam President, seeks to amend the legislation, Section 2 of the existing Act, that is the definition section. And Madam President, we've been immersed in some language over the last few months. In fact, yesterday marked our 50th day in Trinidad and Tobago with stay at home. And when you go through the definitions that are proposed, you would see this language: containment and containment zone, traceability, quarantine and quarantine station, contingency plans, emergency plans, early detection system, emergence of diseases, biosecurity management, sanitary measures and surveillance. And it sounds almost as though it's COVID-19 we're dealing with. But Madam President, that is terminology that will dominate our lives for some time to come. And I would say in the context of this legislation that this was really born out of SARS and the recognition by the OIE and by countries that responded to SARS of the need to modernize legislation. And out of SARS, the OIE commissioned a review of what we do here in Trinidad and Tobago in relation to importation, our permitting requirements, our management of the sale of meat and meat products, the importation of meat products, the standards in markets. A very comprehensive report was rendered by the OIE in March 2013 in relation to this matter of animal and animal products in Trinidad and Tobago. And out of that, Madam President, my predecessors had the good sense to commission work to review the legislation via the engagement of ICA, who engaged a consultant. And when I came in as minister, Madam President, I met a certain amount of work done via the consultant. We've continued that work and made significant changes to it as we went along. And what we have here is a product that we believe deals with what needs to be done now and what would assist us going into the future, removing the reliance we have had on the 65-year-old legislation. So the second area I would point to, Madam President, is the introduction of these new definitions which cover some of the things that are required in our environment now. And they relate to animal disease emergency plan, animal health paraprofessional, for example, containment zone, references to the OIE code. I would say, Madam President, you would see the introduction of this expression, animal health paraprofessional, and towards the end of the bill, you would see the introduction of an offense for persons who offer the services of veterinary services without being qualified to do so. Madam President, I will tell you, growing up in a rural community, we really relied heavily on the Ministry of Agriculture people, animal health assistants and so on, to do a lot of the work with the livestock farmers. We didn't have as many vets as we do now in Trinidad. We didn't have as many. And in fact, the experience of the farmers is that some of these animal health people, some of the stockmen as they call them, offer excellent services. But having said that, Madam President, the vet profession is a regulated profession. It needs to be further regulated, and we are working on legislation to govern that particular profession. But we recognize in the bill that animal health paraprofessionals will continue to provide some support, but we also balance that with the introduction of an offense specifically dealing to those persons who charge for those services and style themselves as a vet without having the capacity or the power in law to do that. The third area I want to point to, Madam President, is the structure that the bill seeks to create. Madam President, the Model CARICOM legislation asked of us to create a new authority to govern this part of our operations in the ministry. And in Trinidad and Tobago, our experience has been it is very difficult to create these new bodies and leave the existing functions in the public service. Our many attempts to create new bodies while still having public service functions existing have not been totally successful, and a lot of times they are met with resistance. So after a considerable amount of work and development of different models, we settled on the model that does not introduce a new authority, but finally, Madam President, deals with this issue of a chief vet officer. It is amazing, Madam President. We've seen the chief medical officer perform absolutely excellent on television and in the function of his duties, and we understand the need for a chief medical officer. We do, in fact, have somebody in the ministry who functions as a chief vet officer, but that person's official title, Madam President, is Technical Assistant Animal Health, so that the statutory powers are not clearly defined, the role is not established in law, and obviously, Madam President, in the public service, the person will not be ranked and would not be compensated in a way a chief vet officer. So what we have done in this legislation, we've treated the inspector and the chief vet officer as the same person, and the powers that are carried out by the inspector under the existing law, those powers have been expanded, but we've recognized that the word inspector and chief vet officer will be used interchangeably. And that allows us, Madam President, once the bill is passed and becomes law, to take the next step of creating in the public service the appropriate position of chief vet officer, so we are at the same level as all the other territories that we interact with around the world. Madam President, so in dealing with the powers of the inspector and expanding it, you would see at 3A to 3F, the proposed 3A to 3F, you would see 30 new powers being identified for the inspector. And those 30 powers relate to what a functionary, a chief vet officer, with the responsibility to do what has to be done in relation to the law, is required to do in 2020 and beyond in Trinidad and Tobago. The fourth area, Madam President, is a very, very important area. When we dealt with the amendment to the Summary Offences Act to increase both the term of prison and the fine for animal cruelty, I referred to work that had been commissioned by the Honorable Attorney General and I, and supported by the Cabinet. And that is, Madam President, as I said before, this bill proposes to expand the regulatory making power of the minister. And as I said, included there is the power of the minister to make regulations dealing with animal welfare standard. This bill was laid in September 2019. And I made the point that at the same time that we laid the bill, we commissioned a 17-member team representing the broad section of animal welfare and health interests in the country to start the work on the regulations, on the standards. And I said that that report was presented to me in January as I asked. It was sent to Cabinet. It is in Cabinet awaiting the deliberations of this bill. And we intend, Madam President, to have those regulations in place as soon as this piece of legislation is proclaimed into law. And the Animal Advisory Committee that is proposed, that the new 3D deals with a small 7-member advisory committee that will assist the minister, the ministry, and the country in creating, supervising, and dealing with all the requirements under the law in relation to animal welfare and health. Madam President, the fifth area I want to point to is to be found in the proposed amendments to Part 2, and they deal with control measures. And those springboard, as the Attorney General loves to say, from the proposed 3F, and 3F deals with animal health measures and the factors which the inspector should take into consideration in crafting animal health measures. And you'd see from the language, harmonization with international standards, risk assessment and science-based measures, regionalization, and being least trade restrictive, and so on. And that is the springboard of the control measures, Madam President, which are proposed in the bill. And the sixth area I want to point to, Madam President, relates to the amendment to the existing Section 13 of the legislation. And those amendments, Madam President, those amendments follow from the amendments in relation to the control measures. But this sixth area, Madam President, is the one that I consider to be the most significant, because what we found, Madam President, is that the minister lacks the power to make regulations. And regulations are where we really flesh out some of the operative parts of an act, where we flesh out some of the more detailed aspect of legislation, where we can even introduce new offenses in accordance with the structure in which offenses could be introduced via regulation. But regulatory powers really gives the bureaucracy the flexibility to function outside the walls of the Parliament, recognizing, as I've always said, Madam President, in relation to points raised by my colleague Senator Mark, that the regulatory making power of any public authority is subject to a wide range of supervision, including the supervisory function of this Parliament and the supervisory function of the judiciary. So, Madam President, that sixth area proposes to expand the current regulatory making power of the minister, and proposes from letter K to letters A, B, which are 18 new regulatory making functions. And I want to highlight, Madam President, the letter O, which is the standards for animal welfare in accordance with the best practices, including standards for animal care and treatment, disaster risk planning for animal safety, health and welfare, and animal health and safety emergency procedures, and a series of powers that the minister would have in relation. Madam President, that regulatory power at P deals with the issue of animal traceability, and traceability, trackability, and accounting for movement have become very topical issues in relation to COVID. We've heard a discussion about invasion of privacy, the use of cell phones to detect people's movement, and so on. We've seen a lot of discussions taking place, and traceability in relation to any infectious disease and traceability of movement are very, very important as control measures. in the regulatory making power, you'd also see contingency plans for emergency affecting animal health. And again, I saw a clip from former President Barack Obama last night on television, and he was so precise 5 years ago or 6 years ago, talking about preparation for this thing that would be unseen and unknown, and it will affect the world and so on. And it was very, it was almost like Nostradamus operating to be able to define this COVID that we're dealing with. And contingency plans really deal with things that we know that are likely to happen, for which we could plan and determine how we're going to react. Madam President, the seventh area deals with import and export requirements. The proposed new section 14 deals with the import requirements, and the export requirements are dealt with under the proposed 16F. And Madam President, we had, for example, to respond to, it is not unusual because Trinidad and Tobago sits right now on the edge of foot and mouth disease, having regard to the fact that Colombia and Venezuela have been identified as sources of foot and mouth disease. We had, in relation to the tainted meat issue out of Brazil, the corned beef, one of my favorite foods, and I was very concerned that I had to be the minister to ban it, but the public health issue took precedent. But we do not import beef, meat from Brazil, but we do in fact import all our corned beef from Brazil. And in dealing with that issue of tainted meat, we recognize the importance of having coordination, a plan on how we're going to respond on dealing with food safety issue. Madam President, just recently, our Food Safety Committee had to respond to a simple thing as ginger in the market. Somebody stealing some ginger from a farmer in Paramin that was treated with weedicide in anticipation of being planted. And Friday, I also had to intervene on another matter relating to sweet potato that didn't really pan out as a public health issue, and that one is in the hands of the police. So the seventh and eighth areas I would point to, Madam President, relate to import requirements and import permits, and those are addressed in our proposed clause 16. The insertion of clause 16 that is proposed seeks to modernize the system that we have now relating to import permits. And I must say, Madam President, I heard my colleague, the Minister of Trade, at the press conference yesterday, the COVID-19 press conference, talk about ease of doing business. I've spoken already about the legislative change we made with import permits for agricultural products, and I mentioned that last week, Monday, we went live with a 100% paperless system that allows us to do an import permit in 3 days now. And I heard, Madam President, the system for the importation of meat is also one of the heavily used areas. And
Minister, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And we've had a lot of success, but I will say, Madam President, the OIE report from 2018, which assessed Trinidad and Tobago's handling of meat and meat products and animals, pointed to the need for us to spend more time on the ground, and that is something that we hear a lot about. At the press conference on Saturday, Prime Minister talked about existing law relating to public health, and he said in going out we would see the public health inspectors and the public health people operating under the power of the county medical officer, going out to places where people congregate and people work and so on, and using the existing powers of the law. And the import permitting system is really, electronic is good, but the OIE pointed to container examination, going on the ground, going to the shelves, going in the marketplace, going to the abattoirs, and making sure what the law says we should do is really being done. Madam President, the ninth area I will identify relates to the important animal welfare section. So we are proposing the introduction of Part 3A, the first time in the law that we will directly address the issue of animal welfare and health, and also the issue of stray animals. And I would say, Madam President, that while we are very happy to amend the Summary Offences Act to increase the fine for animal cruelty to 100,000 and to increase the term of prison to 1 year. Part 3A expands all the provisions relating to animal welfare and health, but also proposes that the repeal of that section of the Summary Offences Act that deals with animal cruelty. So we will not have two separate streams operating. We would repeal the section of the Summary Offences Act dealing with animal cruelty, and this bill will insert into the existing legislation the regime for dealing with animal welfare and health standards to be supported by the regulatory power of the minister that we are introducing. And the last thing, Madam President, and most importantly, I want to point to the offences, and this bill, as I said at the start, introduces some brand new offences. One that really appeals to me a lot, and that is through, Madam President, the insertion of Section 21, deals with, for example, somebody who dumps a part of an animal in a public place. All these people, for example, the pluck shop owners who dump bags of feathers and so on the roadside. I've seen the crab vendors. Madam President, I'm all over the country. See the crab vendors dump parts, and the oyster vendors and so on, and it's an offense and a very serious offense. As I close, Madam President, as I said from the start, towards the end of the bill, from 33 to 37, we propose amendments which deals with amendments to the existing schedules and consequential amendments, including the consequential amendments of the repeal of the summary offences provisions dealing with animal cruelty upon the proclamation of this piece of legislation. Madam President, my friend, the Honourable Attorney General, likes to hear when I reach to this part of it. So I thank you very much, Madam President. I thank my predecessors, the ICA, the technical people in the ministry who have done. I thank the retired Chief Vet Officer, Dr. Kangaloo, your namesake, and I thank my colleagues for giving us the opportunity to debate this bill today and complete it. And Madam President, I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Animals, Diseases and Importation Act, Chapter 6702, be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President, for allowing me this opportunity to address a matter that appears to be very simple and ought to have full consensus among all of us in this chamber. But there are measures in this bill that require us to pause and to seek clarification and some elaboration from the Honourable Minister of Agriculture. Madam President, the first area I would like to ask the Honourable Minister to look at, because when we are talking about protecting and promoting animal health and to establish appropriate standards in that industry, and you look at the definition of animals, Madam President, we are talking about food production that is included in this exercise, whether it's the importation of frozen meat, whether it has to do with the importation of cheese from Australia or New Zealand or Canada or Australia. These measures, these matters are contained in the legislation. And Madam President, I would like to ask the Minister from the outset the level of consultation. who did the minister consult? We know this bill has been here for some months now. As he said, September. But from my research, Madam President, and my engagement, the farmers' union of this country, led by one Mr. Shiraz, I think, Khan, only saw this bill when I made it available to him. So the sheep and goat farmers in this country, which this legislation will impact upon, have told me they were never consulted. So the question has to be asked, given the sweeping and far-reaching changes that are being proposed in this legislation, why did we not have the intervention and the consultation with the sheep and goat farmers in our nation? So I think that the minister would need to address that. Another matter that is of grave concern is what I have conceptualized and captured as the czar of animal health protection and standards, the so-called inspector. I have never seen so much power being located and housed in one individual and some of his colleagues lower down, with no mechanisms of accountability whatsoever. Madam President, when you look at the power of the inspector, you believe you're living in Tsar Russia, way before the revolution, the Bolshevik revolution. That is what you're talking about here. Real power without any accountability. Madam President, I am also concerned about this inspector having the power to create monopolies. This is the livestock industry that we are talking about. And I know that there are many people in this country who currently, as we speak, have a monopoly on the livestock market. And as I'm on this, I would like the Honorable Minister to tell this country what Marilisa Farms, that has been given 1,116 acres of land, which was formerly their Repo livestock station, a chap called Lincoln Thackeray, who is also the owner, Madam President, of General Earth Movers Limited. We want to know the link between this gentleman and Marilisa Farms and this bill that we have here. These are serious matters. I know there's a big goat farmer. You know our Prime Minister is a goat farmer? He rears goat and sheep, over 3,000 to 4,000 goat and sheep in Tobago. How is this bill going to impact on the Prime Minister and his goat farm and his sheep farm? These are matters that we need to get clarified in this debate. It may sound just about animal diseases and importation, but Madam President, it is much more than that. And we have to ensure that nobody is able to use this legislation to create monopolies, because they are already growing monopolies in this industry. And we have to protect the small and the medium-sized farmers against the monopolists and those who dominate the industry at this time, Madam President. So we want to find out what mechanisms are in place. Madam President, when I go through this legislation briefly with you, you will see this czar who is in charge, Madam President, and who can issue permits. he can revoke permit, he can suspend permits. And you know what? When you have to appeal his decision, you go to somebody lower down in the rank, and then he is the person who initially revoked your permit will now come and officiate and tell you whether you can get your permit reinstated. Himself speaking to himself. That is autocracy. That is authoritarianism. That is a kind of dictatorship which shouldn't find its way in a modern democracy. And this bill, Madam President, when you scan it properly, you are seeing, Madam President, these elements, right, located and dotted throughout the pages of this bill. So this is a very serious matter. And Madam President, may I also remind this Honorable Senate through you. I looked at the 1954 Animal Diseases and Importation Bill, or which was an ordinance. You know, this government is encroaching on the separation of powers, Madam President. And I will tell you how. The minister just spoke about the power to make regulations. When we were under colonialism in 1957, if you look at Section 13 of the Act that we are governed by right now, regulations could be made by a minister. But, Madam President, at that time, we were a colonial country. We didn't have an independent country. We didn't have an independent parliament. Now we have an independent parliament. You are telling me, Madam President, 60 years later, you are bringing legislation, Madam President. Madam President, may I ask you or invite you to join me in looking at this section of the legislation. Madam President, go to Section 18 of the legislation, and you will see the amendment, Madam President, to Section 13, which is the regulations. And there are 18, I think more than 18, the minister said 26 new headings in terms of power to make regulations. Madam President, it is there in this section or clause 18, Madam President. This minister, the Honorable Minister that is, will have the power, Madam President, to make regulations to determine fees and costs for inspection, set standards for animal welfare, establish the implementation of animal identification and traceability, the quarantine of aquatic and non-aquatic animals, the operation of quarantine, the procedures to be followed by the veterinary officers, contingency plan, registration, Madam President, importation, manufacture, distribution, labeling, sale, or use of exportation. Madam President, animal feed, appeal procedures, rules and procedures applicable to implementation, payment of fees, scale of charges, population control, Madam President, and any other matter deemed necessary. This is in the hands of one minister. Madam President, in 1957, when we had the law being programmed, I have the Hansard records of the debate. And who moved the legislation in 1957? All the speakers that contributed. Madam President, at that time, when you had regulations, it was procedural. So, and we were under colonial rule. But today, in 2020, this is policy that is being promulgated through regulations. And the minister has not made any mention of the role of the Parliament. Parliament must have an oversight responsibility in any regulations, and particularly those that are being promulgated and being proposed in this legislation. So I serve notice on the Honorable Minister that we are proposing from now that all those regulations that the Honorable Minister is going to make, all must be subject to an affirmative resolution of this Parliament. We are not going to give power
to the minister without any accountability. The minister must be accountable to the Parliament. And that can only take place with an affirmative resolution of this Honourable Parliament, Madam President. So I serve notice on the Honourable Minister that that must be subject to an affirmative resolution, Madam President. Madam President, when I look at the legislation, Madam President, I am seeing conflicts of interest. I am seeing, Madam President, in a section of the law where the minister under, Madam President, may I invite you to look at clause 7 of the bill. And if you go to 3D on page 18, you will see where the minister is going to establish a committee known as an advisory committee on animal health and welfare. And the minister, Madam President, this committee is going to advise the minister, and of course the minister is the powerhouse. He appoints the members, he appoints the chairman, and then of course the minister will have the final say on whatever decisions that are taken. Madam President, we are not living under Crown colony government. We are living in an independent, sovereign, democratic republic. And it is passing strange that this government can bring legislation. It's the same thing they did with the Public Health Ordinance. They went to a 1917 ordinance and sought to introduce regulations on people's movements in this country.
Senator Mark, you know that
Yes, I know, but I'm just making a little comparison so I could tell you.
Yes, but could you not re-debate that, please, Senator Mark?
Yeah. So, Madam President, the minister under this section has the power to establish his advisory committee. He alone. So you have a czar in the inspector, and then you have a powerful supervisor over the czar, the minister. So the two power horses under this piece of legislation are not the stakeholders in the industry, you know. What about the private sector, Madam President? Madam President, when you look at sub 3D, sub 2, and you look at the people who are going to be part of this advisory committee, Madam President, all of them are from the ministry. And 2 of them are appointed by the minister in his own discretion. So the minister has discretion after he appoints about 6 other persons or 5 other persons who are from within the ministry. And Madam President, as I'm on this thing about ministry, we need to be clear in our minds whether we are talking about the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Health. Because I'm seeing, for instance, there's an intersplicing as it relates, or juxtaposing, as it relates to Health Ministry and the Ministry of Agriculture, Madam President. These are matters that are very important. Madam President, this bill is going to affect importers in the private sector. But on the Minister's Advisory Committee, there is no commercial interest being represented here. Where is the private sector in this bill? These are people who are importing, Madam President, as I said, meat, frozen, cheese, ham from different countries of the world. And they are not represented here, and decisions are being taken by the government without their input. Madam President, I believe the government has brought a piece of legislation under this COVID rubric of COVID, even though it was just in September, Madam President, with reduced speaking time, Madam President, and at the same time, Madam President, what they are doing, when you look at this legislation carefully, they are creating a powerhouse. And that powerhouse is the inspector with all of these elements under the inspectorate. You could also call it an inspectorate. And they have total, absolute power. And without any accountability any responsibility. That cannot be fair, Madam President. So I am asking the Honorable Minister, Food and Drugs Division, what role do they have on an advisory committee, Madam President? Because the minister is going to be setting standards. So if the minister is setting standards through regulations and he has an advisory committee, what is the role of the Bureau of Standards? Why leave out the Bureau of Standards? Why leave out the Food and Drugs Division in this advisory committee? These are very important office holders and offices and units. And Madam President, most importantly, as I said, I am putting a plug for the private sector. Because it is the private sector who import meat and cheese and all kind of frozen things from different parts of the world. And this same czar can stop your meat from coming into the country. He can give you a permit today, Madam President, and tomorrow morning, somebody whisper in his ears, don't allow Wademark to import meat, and he can just revoke my permit. And then when he revokes my permit, I have to appeal to him for mercy. The same person who revoked my permit, I have to go to that same person and appeal. And if I'm not satisfied, go into my pocket, Madam President, and go to the Court of Appeal. What kind of madness is this? Madam President, there should be a tribunal, some mechanism. There must be natural justice. There must be fairness in this whole operation. It cannot be that you give all this power to this inspectorate and this inspector, and then when he exercises his power whimsically, arbitrarily, I must now appeal to him for mercy? What do you expect me to get, Madam President? Is licks. And then he says, look, you're happy with my decision? You go in your pocket and go to the Court of Appeal and plead your case. But, Madam President, if I were to do that, my business going through, I have to pay for that. What is the government doing? Why are they setting up this monopoly? In whose interest? This couldn't be in the interest of the small farmers and the medium-sized farmers. Madam President, I want the Honorable Minister of Health, of Agriculture, to table on the desk of the Parliament today, the lease agreement for 1,116 acres of land that was given to a chap called Lincoln Thackeray, who runs a farm called Marilesa Farm.
Senator Mark,
yes,
you
Madam
raised that issue earlier in your presentation. I allowed you to raise it, but I will ask you now to really move on to more relevant matters.
But Madam President, I want to remind this through you, Madam President.
I just want to remind you when I make a ruling that the word I hate to hear after is but.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. But, Madam President, we are dealing with the livestock industry. We are dealing with animals, Madam President. And I'm just simply asking through you that we need clarification because this bill is not in the interest of the small people. This bill is designed for the big goat and sheep farmers in this country. And we know who are the players in that industry. And don't come and use the Parliament to get after your own objectives. We will not permit it. That is why, Madam President, I'm demanding that they should make that available to us. Madam President, this is about agriculture, this is about food. And we can't put food in the hands of a few people. Cannot do that. So, Madam President, wherever you look in this legislation, as I said, you see power oozing through the pores of Azar. Right? Right, Madam President? and the minister brings this thing here innocently, and as if we must just only accept what he has brought here, the Honorable Minister, that is, Madam President. No, we cannot accept what you have brought as you have brought it. We need to change many aspects of the legislation that is before us, Madam President. Madam President, I have certain areas that I'd like to raise here. Madam President, if you go to Section 3D, I have already indicated to you what this composition is like, and I'm recommending to the Honorable Minister that the private sector be incorporated into his arrangement, the Food and Drugs Division, as well as the Bureau of Standards, Madam President. I'm also suggesting for the Honorable Minister's consideration that we need mechanisms in place to ensure that the inspectorate does not trample on the rights of the people. And don't tell me go to the High Court or to the Court of Appeal. If you have money, that's your business. But ordinary small farmers may not have the money to go to the courts. And therefore, they need a mechanism, a tribunal, so that they can appeal the decisions of the inspectorate or the inspector, Madam President. Madam President, if you go to clause 19 of the bill, again, you will see, Madam President, the power of this inspector. The inspector established what is called, under Section 14, import requirements for animal carcasses, animal products, animal-related items based on international standards and science-based risk analysis. But you know, Madam President, who is going to decide that? The minister and the inspector. They are going to decide this, and they are going to publish it, Madam President, in the Gazette. So we must go to the Gazette, Madam President, to get what the government has decided. The Parliament, you are asking today to give you power, Madam President, to do all these things. But you know what, Madam President? We have no say after we pass this legislation. I want to remind the Honorable Minister, this is not a crown colony society. It's not a plantation economy. This is a democratic, sovereign, democratic republic. And therefore, Madam President, we need to ensure that there is oversight. Madam President, when we look at this section, and you see again the kind of power that the minister has, Madam President, and you look at the definition of animal products, Madam President, right? We have not established, we have not seen, Madam President, what are the import requirements that have to be established on a science risk-based analysis.
Senator Mark, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. We haven't seen the standards that are being suggested that must be followed by importers of meat products and animal-related products, Madam President. We are seeing terms like the inspector, Madam President, can prohibit or restrict the importation for any reasonable cause, any animal carcass, animal product, or animal-related product. That is under 16A, subsection 2 of that. This is arbitrary, Madam President. Who is to determine reasonable cause? The inspector? What is advising him? What is guiding him, Madam President? We don't have that. So, Madam President, we are saying that the bill in its current form, who can argue and be against the promotion and protection of standards and the welfare of animals? We can't be against that. But what we are saying, Madam President, these things must be done within a framework of good governance and good governance practices. There must be accountability. There must be responsibility, Madam President. There must be oversight. There must be transparency in all that we do. And that is why, Madam President, both sections 53 and 61 of our Constitution give the Parliament the power to make laws. But we have not abdicated that responsibility to any minister. And this, the Honourable Minister, in the clauses that we have in this bill, is seeking to give himself, and by extension the government, or any future minister, total power without any accountability to the Parliament. And therefore we are saying, Madam President, you want responsibility, there must be accountability. If you want responsibility, you must account. And there must be mechanisms in place to ensure it, Madam President. In this bill, Madam President, in closing, I am seeing a complete breach of the separation of powers principle. I am seeing where the legislature, right, is being conquered, undermined by the executive. The executive wants total power, and they want the legislature to be just in their back pocket. Well, so long as I am a member of this Parliament, we shall expose every move by this government to try to create an authoritarian and dictatorial model through legislation. We will not permit that. So, Madam President, I ask the Minister, through you, to let us know that about the livestock station in that place called Aripo, which was given away recently to a financier of the PNM, who I understand has a lot of lucrative contracts in terms of road works at this time, costing billions of dollars. And we would like to get from the government a clear understanding of what is taking place at this time. And we would want the government, when we get to the committee stage, to look at several suggestions to ensure, Madam President, that we bring, at the end of the day, a piece of legislation that is acceptable to the population of this country, Madam President. Madam President, I thank you very much for allowing me to make my contribution.
Senator Sipasad.
Madam President, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the debate on the bill, an act to amend the Animals, Diseases and Importation Act, Chapter 6702. The main objectives of the bill before us are to: 1, protect and promote animal health; 2, prevent the introduction and spread of animal diseases in Trinidad and Tobago. Oh.
Mike?
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
So should I start over?
No, it's fine.
2, prevent the introduction and spread of animal diseases in Trinidad and Tobago and from other countries. 3, facilitate and regulate trade in animals, carcasses, animal products, and animal-related items. 4, establish standards for animal welfare and protection. The prevention, control, and eradication of animal diseases are critical for many reasons. One example is that a devastating animal disease outbreak has serious economic impacts. These include loss of livelihood, disruption of domestic trade, cessation of access to international markets, threats to food security and public health. It is common knowledge that the impacts of the COVID-19 virus is devastating to both human health and economic well-being. This virus may have originated from an animal source and has become a worldwide pandemic. Detection, prevention, containment, and treatment of animal diseases cannot be underestimated. Still, in the developed world, with stringent laws, practices, standards, and sophisticated technologies, diseases such as bird flu, swine flu, mad cow's disease, and so on arise and spread. Legislation, therefore, can only hope to reduce the incidence and occurrence of animal disease. In our jurisdiction, the discipline and application of this bill to achieve the objectives identified in a given timeline will be challenging and steep. We already know that in Trinidad and Tobago, there are unscrupulous sellers and buyers of wild meat. It was reported recently that many, if not all, the animals in the wild carry some form of pathogen. Wild meat includes agouti, lap, armadillo or tatu, wild hog or quenk, deer, and manikou. So those who indulge in and have an exotic taste for wild meat can be exposed to who knows what, and with the potential to wreak havoc on society. This exotic taste fires the continuing trade of illegal livestock and wild meat from countries such as Guyana and Venezuela. For example, on September 15, 2019, a vessel was intercepted by the Coast Guard south of Icacos with 2 Venezuelan men and a cargo of 42 goats, 1 sheep, and 12 bottles of alcohol. Often livestock brought in illegally is diseased, held in close confinement, and possibly are dead because of lack of care or cruelty, or both. Venezuela and Colombia have been red flagged as a potential source of foot and mouth disease, which is a major threat to livestock. Foot and mouth disease is a highly contagious virus disease and one of the most serious livestock diseases in the world. This disease affects cloven-hoofed animals such as cattle, buffalo, sheep, goats, pigs, and deer. According to Dr. Saeed Rahman, Director of Public Veterinary Health, pathogens such as bacterium, which causes the potentially lethal leptospirosis, salmonella, and trypanosoma cruzi, which cause heart disease in humans, have been found in local wild meat consumed in Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Rahman has also stated that leptospira, the bacteria which causes leptospirosis, is found in the carcasses of all wild meat, especially when they are not gutted properly at slaughter. Further, animals shot in the field and are not properly dressed, that is, properly bled, and there is no inspection before or after death. This allows for the rapid deterioration of the animal carcasses. Madam President, the bill seeks to address these and other issues, including clear definition of animal inspector, Clause 7 and Clause 8(3)(b), establishment of an advisory committee on animal health and welfare to advise and aid the minister regarding animal health policies, animal welfare, strategies, sanitary measures, disease prevention, control, and eradication, Clause 8(3)(d), implementation of an animal disease surveillance system, including contingency plans for response to emergencies affecting animal health, and declaration of an animal disease emergency, Clause 11. Regulations with respect to infected zones, Clause 18. Import requirements, Clause 19, including the establishment of the import requirements for animals, carcasses, animal products, and animal-related items according to international standards or science-based risk analysis. A list of animals, carcasses, animal products, and animal-related items which require an official veterinary health certificate or other official health certificate before importation into Trinidad and Tobago. Inspection of imports, Section 16D. Export requirements, Section 16F. Animal welfare. Madam President, for too long, people who have committed gruesome acts of cruelty and abuse of animals have been allowed to go unpunished. For several decades, animal lovers, activists, and NGOs have been petitioning the government for stiffer penalties for persons found guilty of animal abuse. I believe the recent video showing sadistic people hanging a dog was the last straw. Animals cannot speak for themselves. We must speak for and protect them. Clause 26 of the bill introduces a new category, animal welfare and stray animals. The amendments include prohibition of maltreatment, Clause 26, Section 18A, prohibits any person beating, ill-treating, starving, overdriving, overriding, overloading, abusing, torturing, neglecting, or maltreating an animal. Working animal unfit for work, Clause 26, Section 18B, establishes an offense if any person works an animal that is in an unfit condition for work. Bull baiting, cockfighting, and similar offenses, Clause 26, Section 18D. A person commits an offense where he encourages, aids, or assists at the fighting or baiting of any domestic or wild animal. Welfare of animals, Clause 26, 18I. An owner or person in charge of an animal must provide such animal with sufficient food and clean water, proper shelter and protection from unsuitable weather conditions, including risk of injury or death from flooding and other natural disasters, veterinary care needed to treat and prevent suffering and disease, suitable accommodation during transportation, humane care and treatment. These protections are an immense change and are most laudable. But as I have already mentioned, operationalizing and policing will be an extremely challenging and Herculean task. Fireworks. Madam President, however, with respect to the widespread use of fireworks in heavily populated residential areas with domesticated animals, effective legislation is sorely needed to safeguard against the trauma caused by the illegal use of fireworks. The noise from fireworks, scratch bombs, and other such incendiary devices cause fear and confusion in companion animals, farm animals, birds, and other wildlife. The hearing of most animals is considerably more sensitive than human beings. Fireworks emit sounds up to 190 decibels. Damage to the human ear begins at 75 to 80 decibels. This is significantly more disturbing to animals. The law for both sellers and users of fireworks should carry harsh penalties, especially during the celebratory times. Enforcement, however, cannot be selective and must be a deterrent. Madam President, this bill, together with the amendments to the Summary Offences Act, Chapter 1102, Sections 79(1), 80, and 83(1), and the amendments to the Conservation of Wildlife Act, Chapter 6701, will go a long way in meaningfully protecting animals. I will again emphasize that the bill alone is but a small fraction of the battle. Effectively implementing the measures provided is imperative to win the war. Thank you, Madam President.
Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam President, for the opportunity to contribute to this very important law. May I, first of all, welcome to the Senate bench today the most recent addition to the P&M bench, the Honorable Jason Williams. May I also take this opportunity to thank my colleague, the Honorable Senator Robert Lehunt, as he passes now from this chamber, for his contribution to Trinidad and Tobago and for the very excellent work that he has done. Certainly, I must recognize his contribution as well. Madam President, this bill has been long in the coming. This bill is very relevant to the situation that we find ourselves in Trinidad and Tobago and in the world right now. And permit me to congratulate my colleague, the Minister of Agriculture, the Honorable Senator Clarence Rambarat, for holding on to this issue with a certain purpose and with dedicated effort to bring this bill to Parliament since 2019. And permit me to say why. Madam President, OIE, That is now defined in the definitions clause before us right now as the section which takes advantage of the world coordination of matters treating with the health of animals and their coordination with society and with Trinidad and Tobago. OIE means, according to the clause 4 of the bill, OIE means the World Organization for, clause 6, it means the World Organization for Animal Health. One would hardly think that that acronym matched it, and therefore one obviously has to do a quick search, and you'll realize that OIE means, in fact, the organization coming out of France, based in the Office International of Epizooologie. What does that mean? It is the International Office for Zoological Issues. But very importantly, Clause 6 of the bill anchors one of the most relevant factors for us to consider why Senator Rambarat was so aggressively acute in bringing this law to fruition. Because the OIE did a study in Trinidad and Tobago recognized by Senator Rambarat. It's published in February 2013. They did a PVS evaluation report and a tool for the evaluation of the performance of veterinary services in Trinidad and Tobago. A very comprehensive report which demonstrates what was not working in Trinidad and Tobago and which identified what standards were required to be harmonized to bring Trinidad and Tobago in sync with the global environment of managing health issues in animal welfare, food consumption, transportation on an international basis, etc. And in Clause 6, Madam President, you will find a critically important word which I want to introduce into this debate. And that word is zoonosis. Zoonosis means any disease or infection which is naturally transmissible between animals and humans and vice versa. Zoonosis is the origin of the SARS virus. Zoonosis is attributed to the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic in the transmission of the virus from bats, as it is alleged to have happened, to human beings because of the unregulated supervision of the consumption or close proximity to animals who are wild in nature being encroached upon by human beings who invade their territory. Proximity or consumption, the WHO has many standards and suspicions for it. But zoonosis is the reason why Trinidad and Tobago and the rest of the world is engaged in a lockdown of the entire world for the first time in the history of the globe. There has never been a lockdown of the entire world at the same time, certainly. Not in World War I, not in World War II, not in the Spanish flu. The world has found itself locked down on the basis of zoonosis. And therefore, when the Minister of Agriculture, the Honorable Senator Clarence Rambarat, picked up this work, which was languishing under the last government, and brought it forward to fruition, we took it into the Legislative Review Committee, and we made a very deliberate effect. We rejected the recommendation to create a brand new authority. We rejected the recommendation to abandon the existing law. And we rejected that Chapter 6702, repeal and replace. Why? We did it because of the opposite of what Senator Mark stands for in terms of his contribution. Senator Mark has made a most outstanding contribution that Trinidad and Tobago is not a crown colony, and these are not crown colony days, and the crown colony laws are effectively not useful or relevant in today's society. Let me put that submission to rest. The Exchequer and Audit Act, Chapter 6901, was born as an act of 20 of 1959. We look, Madam President, to our Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. We look, Madam President, to the Disaster Measures Act, which was born in 1978. We will recognize the Exchequer and Audit Act as living proof that a colonial piece of law still has great merit and validity if it's done right. You look, Madam President, to the provisions of the Public Health Ordinance, an act of 1925, in fact, an ordinance of 1925. The Public Health Ordinance has allowed Trinidad and Tobago to be #1 in the world in its management of the COVID pandemic, a colonial law. And permit me, Madam President, to cite this bill in the words of the Constitution, because Senator Mark alleges quite improperly, wrongly, that this law breaches the separation of powers principle and therefore may ostensibly require some different form of treatment, if not a requirement to be withdrawn. It does not breach the separation of powers principle. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago in Section 8 recognizes that, subject to the section, for the purposes of the chapter, the President may from time to time make a proclamation declaring a state of emergency on the basis of several matters, including that there has arisen as a result, that emergency has arisen as a result of the occurrence of any earthquake, hurricane, flood, fire, outbreak of pestilence, or of an infectious disease. That's the Constitution, the supreme law of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Let's go to the Disaster Measures Act. The Disaster Measures Act says where any area in Trinidad and Tobago is affected or imminently likely to be affected by any fire, flood, landslide, hurricane, earthquake, disease, or other calamity, the President may by proclamation declare that area as a disaster area. Let's go to the Public Health Ordinance, which ties in with this law. The Public Health Ordinance in Section 103 equally allows for a treatment, for a declaration of a dangerous infectious disease. In this case, Clause 6 ties in zoonosis, a disease which can be transferred from humans to animals and vice versa, as the backbone. And therefore, a colonial law is entirely relevant. A colonial law such as Trinidad and Tobago's Public Health Ordinance has come to put us, for the first time in Trinidad and Tobago's history, we are #1 in the world for the right reasons. And Madam President, obviously, that requires us to look to the depth of the bill here. So let's look to the high-level aspects. Is this bill proportionate? Does this bill infringe the separation of powers principle? Is there a due process principle anchored into this law? Are the functions and powers that are offered in the amendments that we bring by these clauses ultra vires the Constitution or our fundamental rights or the separation of powers principles? And the answer to all of that is found in the intimate text. To be appreciated, we've left this bill on the order paper for as long as we did on purpose, because it allows fulsome inspection of the law by all stakeholders. And I want to put on the record, there has been deep consultation on this law. In fact, the OEI itself came to Trinidad and Tobago and published reports in 2013 and 2018 of a deep technical nature. But you've heard me as Attorney General time and time again say that you achieve successful implementation of the law by plant and machinery, people, processes, and law. That's why today I could tell the country, Madam President, that we've had 5,000 appearances in court in a pandemic plus, or that we've had over 1,300 virtual court hearings from the prisons, things which people never believed could have happened. We in this Parliament, we in this government passed the laws to allow for virtual hearings and operationalized, saving the taxpayers millions of dollars, giving lives the access to the court for justice on time with immediacy from remote locations. And this bill does the same thing. You ought not to spend precious time reinventing an authority, populating a new public service when you have officers of excellence like Dr. Saeed Rahman, who I confess went to Presentation College with me in sixth form, a serious man of business. We look at Dr. Kangaloo. Forgive me for dragging that noble name into this debate. Madam President, you may know him. An excellent performer in the public service of Trinidad and Tobago, giving of his life and talent to our country. Why re-establish a new mechanism, a new authority, beat up with trade unions, quarrel about who is going to be expanded or not? You see, that is to play into the Senator Wade Mark handbook for bacchanal and distraction when you can simply retrofit the law. Senator Mark makes the submission that we should have a tribunal. Why do you want a tribunal? Why would you need a tribunal, Madam President, when the new Section 21G says that you have the right to ask for a review by the inspector or chief veterinary officer? Obviously, that then allows you the privilege in subsection 2 of that to have an appeal to the High Court, not the Court of Appeal, as Senator Mark makes it up as he goes along. There's no Court of Appeal here. And in any event, if you put a tribunal forward, your right of appeal from the tribunal will have to go to the court anyway. So the normal principles of rationality, of measure, are subjected to Section 14 of the Constitution, are subjected to the Judicial Review Act. The normal prescriptions on prescribed costs will apply so that the cost is managed. But there is no way that this law is capricious. There's no way that this law is unreasonable, because the due process requirement in Section 21G, as we introduce it in Clause 28, allows for rationality and proportionality in law. Could you imagine the foresight of the Honorable Minister of Agriculture in spending years to develop this law when the world has shut down on zoonosis today? Madam President, that tells you there's a plan, there's an attention, there's an acute, anxious scrutiny of professional work in this government, and I salute my colleague, the Minister of Agriculture. You see, Madam President, it looks easy when you see the law. Eh? Oh, why they didn't do it before? This is an act of Parliament. It's now 56 years old. The independent body, that is the Office International of Zoologists, of Epizooalité, that was born in 1924. It's now 96 years old. It's underwritten by the World Trade Organization. It is the gold standard. 5 minutes, much obliged. And in looking at that, the recommendations for the functions of the inspector are clearly driven by international best practice, because you are bound to implement in a proportionate manner, Madam President, and I take you to Clause 9, I take you to Section 11 of the Act, I take you to Clause 12, I take you to Clause 13, I take you to Clause 14, and in particular, when you see the language in Clause 9, you are bound in Clause 11 as well to introduce proportionate measures. That stood out to me in the Legislative Review Committee as we settled the work at the Attorney General's office, led by the chairman, because the Minister of Agriculture is the chairman of the Legislative Review Committee and works his heart out in legislation. And I tell you that that word proportionate, followed by the word measures in Clause 11 of the bill, the new Section 5E, subsections 4 and 5, underwrite the proportionality of law. There is nothing untoward in the regulations that are now provided. Why would you want to have regulations other than by the way we do it? Madam President, let me put you into an obscene alternative reality for a moment, where the public health regulations that I can tell you we do overnight by way of cabinet virtual meetings, I as Attorney General, could you imagine introducing public health regulations for Senator Mark to deal with in the Parliament by affirmative resolution? We would have a train line of coffins in Trinidad and Tobago today while we debated that law. Because I'll tell you this, you still have supervision via the courts. In fact, the attorneys at law for many persons coming from the opposition, including past senators of the opposition, have lost every single case that they took to court under the public health regulations. Every single case has been lost. The point that I raised there in the context of this bill is that they had the right to challenge it in court. They lost every time. We will pursue the costs for the taxpayer, but imagine the fiasco that this country would have under a public health regulation, match it up to this bill now, the disease and importation requirements, where you would have to come to Parliament and spend days trying to convince Senator Wade Mark to pass public health regulations. No, Madam President, that alternative reality must never see Trinidad and Tobago. Permit me to deal with one last point in the few minutes that I have. I confess my love of animals. I'm a deep lover of animals. I accept my place second in life for my wife's affection because she loves our dog and children by far more than she does me. So I will tell you, Madam President, it gives me great pleasure as the Attorney General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Minister of Legal Affairs to birth the new Clause 26. We made a commitment to Trinidad and Tobago that we would treat with fireworks, we would treat with animal cruelty, we would treat with standards, we would introduce microchipping into animals, as you see the regulations which are in and a part of this bill have, Madam President. And that, therefore, meets with an objective of compliance on the part of the government. And we had deep stakeholder consultation on those issues, as the interest groups will no doubt confirm. Madam President, apart from coming to pilot the other legislation that I came to participate in this debate, and certainly at committee stage as well. We are ready, willing, and able to pass this law. It is ready for immediate operationalization, and I thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for recognizing me to join this debate on what is an act to amend the Animal Diseases and Importation Act, Chapter 6702. And Madam President, this bill, on the face of it, seeks to do several things, and amongst them is to regularize the imports of animals and the animal carcasses into Trinidad and Tobago, and also treat with issues relating to animal welfare and stray animals. And Madam President, I know it has been a very topical issue, and I'll start off with the part of the bill that deals with animal welfare and stray animals. During this COVID-19 lockdown that we experienced in Trinidad and Tobago, many of us saw what can only be described as disgusting behavior by some members who ill-treat animals, Madam President, where you saw humans hanging a dog somewhere in San Fernando. Then you saw another dog being chopped up. Madam President, it is time that we in this Parliament protect those persons and animals who cannot protect themselves. I know we treated with this issue briefly when we passed the Miscellaneous Provisions 2020 bill, Madam President, just a couple weeks ago, where this Parliament took a decision to increase the fines for animal cruelty from $100,000 to imprisonment for a term of 10 years, which was previously $400 or imprisonment for 2 months. So we took that decision in this Parliament to increase the fines and increase the terms of imprisonment if someone is found guilty of animal cruelty by the court, by the magistrate's court, that they now face a maximum fine of $100,000 and imprisonment of 1 year. Now, in this bill that was introduced in this Parliament, Madam President, this bill was actually laid prior to the introduction of that miscellaneous provisions bill 2020 that we passed. When you look at clause 26 of this bill, Madam President, it outlines offenses relating to animal cruelty. And I will go through a couple of the offenses, Madam President. But the point I want to make here is that the fines have even increased from what we did on the last occasion. Because now the fines are, if a person is found guilty of animal cruelty or in terms of affecting the welfare of an animal, they will commit an offense and they are now liable on summary conviction to a fine of $200,000 and imprisonment for a term of 5 years. So I think I wanted to make that point, Madam President, that we have increased the fines even more in just a couple of weeks. Now, over the weekend, I even saw an article relating to horse farms. This was found in Loop TT, Madam President. I tried to pull up the article, but apparently it's down on the website. And basically, there were horse farms in Trinidad, Madam President, that were asking for donations for the horses, because I believe 1 or 2 of the horses actually died because of starvation, because they weren't getting the required feed and they weren't getting the proper diet to keep these horses alive. And some of these horses actually lost weight, Madam President, bodily weight, that affects their ability and their performance. And I say that, Madam President, because when you look at the construct of this bill, we must have in the back of our minds that someone who has a farm and these horses may have suffered because of lack of resources can now find themselves committing an offense. So the point is, Madam President, we must establish some level of defense for these persons, because we are all certain that these persons are not ill-treating these animals intentionally. It all happens to do with a depletion of the resources of those particular farms. So this is one of the improvements I'm suggesting that we can look at in terms of the bill, because we don't want persons to fall to become criminally liable for an offense whereby they have not intended to commit that offense, and it's not within their powers. Now, the other provisions that deal with the animal welfare, one of the issues I would ask the Minister of Agriculture when he's responding is that whether or not the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service was actually consulted, and whether any training has been done with respect to the investigations when it comes to treating with issues of animal cruelty and animal welfare. I know that there are not much cases before the court in terms of how we can look at how the court treats with issues of animal welfare. In this jurisdiction, I happen to find several cases in the United States that there were decisions in terms of what will constitute animal welfare, animal cruelty. The bill spells it out in some detail in terms of what animal welfare is, because, Madam President, you will know that it now places a level of care. So when we deal with the law of negligence, there's a duty of care. Because of the relationship between the two persons, there's a duty of care. Once there's a breach of that duty, and it's proximate in terms of remoteness, and damages flow, then you are liable for negligence. And I saw that a statutory duty of care is now placed on an animal owner so that they can care for these animals, because, again, they will face criminal fines. And I happened to have a conversation with the Minister of Agriculture earlier, and I asked him if we can look at one of the clauses that I found that may have been drafted a bit vague. And that is clause 18E, Madam President. And in a nutshell, what does that say? It says that if a person has been found guilty or convicted of committing an offense of animal cruelty under what will now be Section 18A or Section 18B. Section 18A deals with prohibition of maltreatment. 18B deals with working animal unfit for work. What it does, Madam President, it allows the court to detain that animal away from the owner, so there's a deprivation of property. Now, I was looking at it in the context of whether or not this will be constitutional. Now, if we look at the application of the Surratt principle, we will see that there can be some level of balance and exercise in terms of a due process. Because at the end of the day, it's not an executive decision being exercised by, for example, the minister or the inspectorate, but it is by the court. So the court allowed the detention of the animal. So I'm more comforted by that fact. The fact that I'm not comforted, Madam President, is that under the legislation, 18E2, it states the pending hearing of the complaint, which means while the complaint has been laid, the person has been charged, brought to court to treat with animal cruelty, the court does have the power to detain that animal. Madam President, we all understand how long matters take in the courts. So you can have animals being detained for 1, 2, or 3 years. Because in this country, although the Attorney General will boast how much he likes, it is sometimes that even a case that deals with obscene language in this country can take about 2 to 3 years. And now you're bringing cases into the system that may very well take that length of time, and you have the court having the power to detain those animals. We already have a shortage of resources for persons who deal with animals. Most of the groups that deals with animal welfare will tell you of the shortages in terms of the lack of resources at the pounds and the lack of resources for food for these animals, Madam President. So that is the issue I want to raise with respect to how are we going to treat with this? Because you can't just detain these animals and then you don't have proper accommodation for them, because you don't want them to fall into the same issue that they were previously in terms of being abused there and then going into an overcrowded pound or some other quarantine facility. So that is the issue I wanted to raise with respect to the detention of these animals and the length of time that the cases will take to be heard before the court. And I also asked the Minister of Agriculture, I raised a point earlier in terms of the welfare, the issue with the horses, that whether or not the Ministry of Agriculture can offer some level of assistance to all of these persons who have animals, or some of these pounds that are stored, that animals are in, if we can lend some assistance to those animals. Now, the Attorney General, and I was disappointed because the Attorney General said that he birthed this new clause 26. He said that this Attorney General birthed clause 26 in terms of dealing with animal welfare. Madam President, I had to go back to check where the paternity of this legislation came from. And you would see, Madam President, almost word for word, if you look at the Summary Courts Act, Chapter 1102, at Section 78, 79, all the way up until about Section 82, you would see the exact offenses that are found in Clause 26 are also found in the Summary Offences Act, which was introduced by Act 2 of 1953, pre-independence. So how could this government say that they are dealing with animal cruelty when these were offenses already on the book, Madam President? What we did as a parliament is increase the fines and increase the imprisonment for these offenses. So it is not that anybody should take credit for these offenses because they have already been on the law book since 1953 in Trinidad and Tobago, Madam President. So that, I was very disappointed when the Attorney General said that, because I did look at the Summary Offences Act before we dealt with this, before I started my research with this particular piece of legislation. Now, Madam President, I want to also look at this issue that deals with the quarantine facilities. And the quarantine stations, Madam President, is something introduced by new section 17 of the bill. And this deals with the inspector designating various quarantine stations for animals to be quarantined, Madam President. And they said that notwithstanding subsection 1, private premises shall not be designated as a quarantine station without the consent of the owner or the occupier of the property. Now I want to ask the Minister whether or not, or how many, this is really a policy issue, I'm not attacking the legislation at this section, but whether or not he can explain or inform the Senate how many quarantine stations are they intending to set up, how many, if any, are established already, and when we look at the budget, whether or not the Ministry of Agriculture has the budgetary allocation to really properly implement this particular piece of legislation. Because we know, and I feel sorry for the Minister of Agriculture, because he has received the least of the budget pie when it comes every fiscal year. Because while there are certain very good parts of the legislation in terms of treating with animal issues and the prevention of animal diseases, there are other parts that we are not comfortable with. It is whether or not the minister has the resource capacity to properly implement this bill. Because we don't want it to be something just on the law book, and then the ministry is claiming that we don't have the money. So that we have to look at also when we are passing legislation in this parliament, whether or not we're just passing legislation for it to look good, or whether we really want it to work, Madam President. Now, Senator Mark raised some very interesting points when it comes to the advisory board. And the advisory board is found at new section 3D of the bill. And this section, Madam President, it establishes an advisory committee on animal health and welfare. And it comprises of no more than 7 members. A veterinary surgeon, a senior technical officer from the ministry with the responsible for health, so Ministry of Agriculture, ministry from the Ministry of Health, representative from the THA, so we're covering Tobago, a representative of the Zoological Society of Trinidad and Tobago, and 2 members in the minister's own discretion. Now, Madam President, there is something called the Livestock and Livestock Products Board. I wonder if the minister can consider whether or not we can add them onto the list, and I'll explain why I ask for them to be added on the list. There's also, I saw on the website, called a Poultry Surveillance Unit and the National Animal Disease Center, who I have not also seen as part of the composition of this advisory committee, who would advise the minister in terms of the creation of policy. And you would see, Madam President, from the information that is available on...
Senator Hussain, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And you would see from the information that is available online, Madam President, and this is one thing that the bill is trying to do. It is trying to standardize the importation guidelines and criteria for live animals and also carcasses to be brought into Trinidad and Tobago. But you will see right now how inconsistent the approach is. Because from the website TT Connect, you would see that if you have to bring in aquarium fish, the application is made to Fisheries Division. If you have to bring in a companion animal, it has to be made to the Chief Veterinary Officer. For horses, the Chief Veterinary Officer or the Senior Veterinary Officer. Food-producing animals, Chief Vet again. Live-day-old poultry, the Agricultural Planning Division, and once approval is obtained, to the Chief Vet Officer again. And then you have wild animals and non-domesticated birds, the Wildlife section. Poultry carcasses, it goes to the Agricultural Planning Division, then to the Chief Vet Officer. So I would hope that now, through the introduction of this bill, that it makes it easier, rather than make it more bureaucratic for persons to import animals, live animals, or even animals for consumption in Trinidad and Tobago. Because we want it to be that we are passing laws to make it easier for our citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to do business, while at the same time protecting the public health of our country, Madam President. And The last point I want to leave on is that the Attorney General said that the reason for trying to not include the affirmative resolution in terms of the minister's power to make regulation is because of the fight that he will get into Parliament, that Senator Wade Mark wouldn't agree to what the government brings. But, Madam President, time and time again we say, if you bring good law, we will support your good law. We will get to that conversation in the next time, Madam President. I am not going to be distracted by the Attorney General. But, Madam President, the Attorney General, who is the defender of the public interest of Trinidad and Tobago, is telling this country that we don't want parliamentary oversight because the opposition will oppose. That is what is coming from the defender of the public interest. On this side, we will always call for legislation to be scrutinized by this government because we do not trust them, Madam President. We do not trust them. Because for far too long, we have seen that they are introducing laws into this country, in this Parliament, that continues to erode at the constitutional rights and privileges of citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And with these few words, Madam President, I thank you very much.
Senator Dylan Remy.
Madam President, I thank you for allowing me to participate in this debate on this important bill, an act to amend the Animals, Diseases and Importation Act, Chapter 6702. One of the stated purposes of this bill is to protect and promote animal health and to prevent the introduction of spread and of animal disease within Trinidad and Tobago. The bill also from other countries. It also and other purposes are to facilitate and regulate trade in animals, carcasses, animal products, and animal-related items, to establish standards for animal welfare, and for other connected purposes. Madam President, my contribution will be related to the introduction and spread of animal diseases within Trinidad and Tobago and from other countries. And as the Attorney General said, the bill coming at this point in time in Trinidad and Tobago is extremely relevant in the midst of the current COVID-19 pandemic caused by the SARS-2 coronavirus, making this bill so important because this disease called SARS-2 corona, caused by the SARS-2 coronavirus, is a zoonotic disease, again, as the minister already mentioned, and that can be transmitted from animals to people, or more specifically, a disease that normally exists in animals, but can infect humans. And so we know that these animals, the animals that are being imported, just cannot cause diseases in other animals, but also transmit disease to other humans. Hence the importance of this bill. Madam President, I looked at an article from the World Health Organization dated November the 13th, and summarizes the importance of zoonotic diseases as it relates to influenza. Summary, I'll just mention the summary points. Humans can be infected with avian, swine, and other zoonotic influenza viruses, such as the avian influenza. And we know we had H1N1 as one of those. The second point, human infections are primarily acquired through direct contact with infected animals or contaminated environments. And again, that is important in terms of the spread. The third point, avian, swine, and other zoonotic influenza virus infections in humans may cause diseases ranging from mild upper respiratory tract infections, and we have other diseases like pneumonia, as we see happening now with SARS, with the coronavirus. The other point, the majority of human cases of influenza and virus infections have been associated with direct or indirect contact with infected live or dead poultry. And therefore, controlling the disease and animal source is critical to decreasing risk to humans. And the final point, influenza viruses with the vast silent reservoir in aquatic birds are impossible to eradicate. And therefore, to minimize public health risks, you need quality surveillance in both animal and human populations, thorough investigations of every human infection, and risk-based pandemic planning. These are essential. This article, I think, allows me to realize the importance of this bill coming at this point in time. I turn my attention, Madam President, to some clauses of the bill. On page 2, clause 6, subsection C, where the bill defines ports of entry. And it says a defined port means the ports of Port of Spain, Chaguaramas, Point Lisas, and Scarborough. And then talked about aerodromes, including Piarco and A.N.R. Robinson International Airport. Just a question here for the minister. Is it that you can, the other ports like, say, Charlottesville, where they have lots of cruise ships and stuff coming in, is not included under this definition? The other point I would bring on page 13, clauses 7 and 8, and the understanding that I had about these clauses 7 and 8, giving the inspector wide-ranging powers, I saw these clauses in the light of the powers that, the similar kind of powers that the chief medical officer has, and can make take specific actions in cases like we have right now. I did not see, as Senator Mark talked about, a czar. I did not see that as the role of the powers that were being given to this inspector, but that it was making the inspector be able to make decisions in critical instances like we are seeing happening here now, where the chief medical officer is giving appropriate advice to the government. Madam President, on page 18, again, clause 8, section 3D, that speaks about the committee and advisory committee on animal health and welfare. When I read this initially, I saw that there was no role there for the inspector. So as a question to the minister, is the senior technical officer from the ministry with responsibility for animal health that person? Because I think you were saying that the chief, there's an interchange between the inspector and the chief veterinary officer or some such thing. I just wanted to make that, to get that clear, whether this person represents the inspector. I also note that on this committee, there's a representative from the ministries with a representative from the ministry with responsibility for health. And I'm saying this because it means that this committee can be meeting and making policy decisions that will affect both health and the health in humans and health in animals. And I think this is very important. Page 21, clause 11, 5A, the inspector shall, 5A1, the inspector shall establish an animal disease surveillance system to detect animal diseases, animal health hazards, etc. Again, I applaud this surveillance system being introduced, and I cannot imagine that well, what I would say is I would imagine what's happening now, since this is a new clause, what is happening now with surveillance of animals and animal diseases? Is it that it's happening but just not put in law, given the importance of what we have happening here over the last couple of years in terms of zoonotic diseases? So that's clause 11(5)(a), section 1. In subsection 3, that says that the inspector shall establish laboratories capable of diagnosing and differentiating relevant diseases. Again, very important. And I note that my question to the minister is, does our veterinary diagnostic laboratory have the capacity to diagnose the emerging diseases that we have right now? As we see what's happening now with the COVID-19 epidemic, we have to be bringing in machines to be able to diagnose the relevant diseases that we have right now. Is the veterinary diagnostic laboratory capable? And is it something that we should, if it's not, if it's something that we should be looking at right now in terms of increasing their capability of diagnosing these emerging diseases? And on page 24, clause 11 again, new section 5E subsection 2, the subsection 2 that says 24, right. It says, in the event of an outbreak of a disease and where zoonotic disease is suspected, the inspector shall notify the ministry responsible for health immediately. Again, I note that because usually in these things are very time related. 1 day, 2 days, a week can make a significant difference. And we are saying here that this law is saying that the inspector should immediately. So we have the representative from the Ministry of Health on the advisory committee, and we are now giving the person who is responsible for the animals responsibility to immediately notify the Ministry of Health if they notice any diseases, and I think that's applaudable also. I remember during the H1N1 epidemic when we had to sit, for the first time, I had to sit with the veterinary officers, and they were talking about what they had to do in terms of monitoring the poultry. And it was the first time I was hearing about culling of poultry, because they were talking about what they had to do as a part of their responsibility in dealing with the H1N1 epidemic. So I think this is so important for the relationship between health and the veterinary department. Madam President, I think this bill is important, and I'm saying that specifically as we are seeing what is happening here now, the impact of this zoonotic disease, and I applaud the minister in bringing it now, and I trust that we are going to continue to have an excellent debate. I thank you, Madam President.
Senator De Freitas.
Thank you, Madam President, for the opportunity to join this debate on an act to amend the Animals, Diseases and Importation Act, Chapter 6702. And, Madam President, it has been said by all speakers that have gone before me that this bill before us today is extremely relevant, if not for protection purposes, but simply in terms of what is occurring globally right now. And, Madam President, we all understand that human health and diseases are no joke. And what this bill tries to achieve, really and truly, is to make the system that we had in Trinidad and Tobago in relation to animal diseases specifically, which can indeed and in fact affect humans, more robust. And it does that in two ways. It implements checks and balances, and it ensures that there's an individual responsible for ensuring that we have best practices in relation to animal husbandry. So, Madam President, as we've come to realize, anyone who has been watching the once daily, now tri-weekly press conferences from the Ministry of Health, you would understand that what we are trying to achieve really comes on the back of a system that has been put in place. And this bill before us, from clauses 7 to clauses 26, treats with the implementation or the beefing up of that system. What is the system that I'm talking about? It's a system that has 5 steps in it. And when you do these 5 steps, it ensures that the problem that we've had in the world thus far, since earlier this year, can be treated with effectively. Madam President, it's scanning, identifying, isolating, treating, and then repeating that process. And what I will do here today is go through the bill and several of its clauses and identify the categories that they fall under and attempt to show effectively exactly how they would work together. So, Madam President, I will start at Clause 7, which, before you do any of this, and in response to Senator Mark, and in agreement with Senator Dylan Remy, I do not believe that the inspector is any kind of czar. One of the things that must happen when you're trying to set up a system like this, and we've seen it with the CMO and the Attorney General has alluded to that, is that you have within that individual the requisite knowledge to effectively respond to a threat in a short period of time. But also added to that individual is the ability, through the requisite knowledge that they have, to implement as best as they can preventative measures so that you do not get to the stage of an outbreak. And in the inspector, as outlined in this bill, vis-a-vis the chief veterinary officer, I see the same thing. And for me, in terms of a proper response to any kind of an outbreak coming from an animal, I would rather have the powers and functions resident in that one individual being able to effectively and timely respond so that the threat does not grow to a level that we cannot control. So, Madam President, Clause 8 goes on to speak to the power, the functions, the power to delegate, and again in response to Senator Mark, who raised the issue of a conflict of interest, you would also find in Section 8, Clause 8(4), where it reads, any person to whom a function is delegated under this Act and who has any direct or indirect interest, whether actual or reasonably perceived interest in any matter or other action to be taken by the inspector, shall communicate his interest to the inspector. So it treats at that particular part of the bill, Madam President, with that conflict of interest that Senator Mark was referring to. Madam President, I move on to the advisory committee, which can be found at Clause 8(3)(d). Now, one of the reasons that I like this particular part of the bill is because Senator Dylan Remy spoke to having a person from the Ministry of Health on the advisory committee. And whether it is the chief veterinary officer or whether it is a senior technical officer, the point to me is that the minister, because the advisory committee reports to the minister and advises the minister, if the chief veterinary officer is on the advisory committee, then it means you don't have one person, which is that inspector or CVO, advising the minister alone. The minister has another avenue by which he can gain insight into what is occurring and therefore mount an effective response in conjunction with the chief veterinary officer. What I also want to say about the advisory committee, because I think Senator Mark is the one that raised it, in terms of lack of consultation, and the Attorney General addressed that when he indicated that the OIE would have done their very robust report several years ago and consultation would have been done then. But what this bill goes on to do, by allowing for 2 members to be chosen by the minister to also be on the advisory committee, is to ensure that people who are in the industry can also be part of that advisory committee, which will actually give advice to the minister. And just for an example, you can have individuals from the processing industry, which is caught in this bill, and you could also have individuals from the agricultural sector or the agricultural society. So it's not about just having consultations several years ago. What you also have is the ability of individuals from the sector who are affected by the regulations and the policies you can find in this bill, also able to contribute by having a direct line to the minister through the advisory committee. So, Madam President, I move on to clause 8.3(ef), where you have the scanning part of the process beginning. And it does so by allowing the minister by order to designate any diagnostic, research, or other laboratory as an official or approved laboratory as may be required for the purposes of this act. Now, when dealing with animal husbandry, one of the aspects that must be taken into account is how you're going to treat with health issues on your farm, for example. And if you, as a farmer, cannot identify why a particular animal under your care has died, the correct thing to do is to have that animal tested at a lab, just in case something has come up by way of a disease that you need to know about for two reasons. One, because if this is a disease on the farm, then you need to know because it could affect every single other animal on your farm and destroy your business. But secondary to that, there's a public health issue that needs to be taken into account here. And once you send that animal to the lab to be tested, that is where the scanning process of this bill takes place. And if you read the clauses as they flow, because you go on to clause 9, you would understand that it even goes on to stipulate what happens when you identify a potential threat by way of a disease. So you have the farmers with an animal that dies. You don't know what caused the death. It is sent to a lab, or a designated lab as designated by the minister, or a private lab. The disease is identified because you need to have that identified for the safety of the farm and its process as well as public health. And then that process flows on from there to be able to go to the inspector or the chief veterinary officer if it is a threat, which then goes on to the minister. So, Madam President, clause 10 of the bill speaks to the proper response after you've identified the threat. And the proper response in a case like this is isolation. And at clause 10, you would see where it says, where a veterinary officer suspects that a notifiable disease exists in any premises, the veterinary officer shall without delay inform the inspector, and upon receipt of the verbal or written approval of the inspector, and it goes on to outline the process which must be taken place. And one of those processes, Madam President, is that you would have isolation taking place so that you stop the spread of any potential disease taking place throughout the population or throughout the animal husbandry sector in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, moving on to clause 11, we see where, under the categories that I've outlined, you have scanning being expanded all the way to identification. And how does that happen? Well, under subsection 5A1 to 5, you see the establishment of an animal disease surveillance system to detect animal diseases. This is very important, extremely important, because this means that you're not waiting for a farmer to find a dead animal to then send to a lab. That is just one process of scanning taking place. But if there's a problem where the farmer decides, well, I'm not going to send this animal, it's going to cost too much or whatever reason, there's that surveillance system that has been put in place so that you can discover a problem before it gets out of hand. Madam President, it goes on in 5B to actually add to that process of isolation and indicate exactly how, after you've isolated a particular area or a particular farm, how that revocation will be taking place. But what I like about this bill, and this is how I know a lot of thought went into it, is that when you get to the stage of treatment, it begins with preventative and then accounts for reactive. What do I mean by that? It means, Madam President, that at Clause 11.5c, you have an animal disease emergency plan. And it's not an emergency plan that is set up and just left. It actually is being reassessed every 4 years towards updating of that plan 6 months after that reassessment. It also goes on, Madam President, after 5C to talk about contingency planning. And then after the contingency planning, it goes to lay out the process at 5E for a declaration of animal disease emergency. So what that means is that if your surveillance doesn't work, if your contingency planning doesn't work, you have put in place a process for the declaration of animal disease emergency. And Madam President, once again, this just goes to show that what we are doing here is to ensure that when you're dealing with animal disease and zoonotic diseases, that you want to have a robust process in place to ensure that we do not end up in a situation again, coming out of Trinidad and Tobago specifically. Because what happens is that, and the bill speaks to it a little bit when you're dealing with importation and exportation, what happens is that you can have the best system in the world in terms of surveillance, contingency planning, emergency responses. But if it is that your neighbor or your neighboring country doesn't have a robust system, then you can very well import that very disease that you're trying to prevent from happening. And that is why I commend the Minister of Agriculture for bringing this bill today, because what it's doing is really beefing up the industry in Trinidad and Tobago to ensure that we, as a country, aren't the weak link in that process to protect the planet and the human race. So, Madam President, I move on to treatment measures in terms of identifying infected zones, which is at Clause 12.6.1-2, and it speaks to the process of setting up and operating of these infected zones. And it does everything by way of outlining limitations that can take place. Limitations by way of movement in and out of animal carcasses or live animals in these infected zones, because as much as you set up these infected zones, one of the things that you have to do is that if for all of your planning, a disease outbreak still happens, and it could happen, because I could tell you now, we all know where this coronavirus, COVID-19, came from. We all have heard of the biosecurity labs that they have, biosecurity level 3. We all know of the contingency planning that they have there, but somehow this virus was able to make its way across the planet, infecting up to 4 million people and more. So what you want to do, Madam President, is set up the processes as much as you can prior. So when you're dealing with infection zones, you limit the movement in and out so that you can limit the spread, even if after you've put all of these things in place, it still happens to have an outbreak in Trinidad and Tobago. So, Madam President, at Clause 19, we return to the scanning by dealing with imports and exports.
Senator, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. So we deal with the imports and exports, and what it does at Clause 19, it's established import and export requirements. Now, I just want to answer, I think it was Senator Mark, who was speaking and saying that this would affect the small man. Now, Madam President, at Clause 23, 16F2, it speaks to the Chief Veterinary Officer ensuring before any animal carcass or any live animal is exported from Trinidad and Tobago that you must meet import requirements of the country that you're exporting it to. Now, the reason why this is beneficial, I see, to the small man is that one of the problems that I have encountered repeatedly in this industry is that a lot of people limit themselves to marketing their products in Trinidad and Tobago. They cannot export because for one reason or the other, they cannot meet the requirements as needed by the importing country. And to have this part of the bill, this put into the bill, to ensure that anybody wanting to export will have their products checked and have a certificate of clearance by the Chief Veterinary Officer bodes well for any entity that wants to increase their revenue by exporting those products. Madam President, I just want to quickly close by responding specifically to Senator Mark and Senator Hussain, who keep speaking to oversight is needed through affirmative resolution. Madam President, what I will say is this. You have robust measures put inside here. When you're dealing with disease outbreaks, you need to move quickly. Senator Dylan Remini spoke to it, it's time sensitive. To sit in a parliament and argue over an affirmative resolution in terms of regulation and what needs to be done can commit all of us to the grave if it takes too long to do that. And what I would say, Madam President, is that Senator Mark is well aware that affirmative resolution is not the only oversight mechanism that this parliament has. How many times has he put urgent questions on the order paper for what is going on right now? Every single sitting that we have 2 matters on the adjournment coming from Senator Mark. All of these things and processes are oversight mechanisms that can be used in a situation like this where there's an emergency. So to have affirmative resolution, Madam President, I do not agree to that. Senator Mark and Senator Hussain knows fully well that they can use any other oversight mechanism and process down to a joint select committee to raise any questions that they may have in regards to regulations. So, Madam President, I close by saying this. The importance of this bill cannot be refuted. I think everybody understands that. And the best way to put it across is a quote that I read just this morning from the Ghanaian president. We know how to revive the economy, but what we do not know is how to bring people back to life. And I think that sums up everything. With those few words, Madam President, I thank you.
Honourable Senators, the Minister of Finance is here, and so we're going to revert to item 8 on the order paper. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Minister of Finance, can the Prime Minister inform the Senate as to what mechanism would be employed to ensure the fair distribution of the 2000 fuel support grant for Maxi taxis?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. The fuel support grant will be issued to all active Maxi taxis within the Ministry of Works and Transport system and will be distributed by the Ministry of Works in conjunction with the licensing authority. So that the licensing authority, the licensing office, Transport Commissioner's Office, has a register of all Maxi taxis that have been inspected and are roadworthy and are currently actively on the road on the various routes, and therefore the Ministry of Works and Transport, using its records, will distribute the fuel support grant. What I can also say, Madam President, is that we are close to a decision as to exactly what form the grant will take. There are 2 options. One is a cash grant by way of a check, and the other is a fuel card. Both NP and Unipet have the facility of a fuel card, a prepaid fuel card, and we are tending towards the fuel card because that would give great accountability, because the number of the vehicle is on the card, so that the fuel would actually be used for the Maxi taxi itself. However, we may still, after consultation with the drivers, the Minister of Works and Transport and his staff are in consultation with the drivers and owners and operators of Maxi taxis, you may still come to a decision as to whether it should be a cash grant or not.
Senator Mark.
Can I ask the Honourable Minister whether he's aware or can share with us the number of Maxi taxis that would benefit from this fuel support grant? Through you, Madam President.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm advised by the Minister of Works and Transport that there are just over 6,000 maxi taxis on the register. But over the years, a number of maxi taxis may have become dysfunctional, no longer in use, and would still be on the register. So the Transport Commissioner has estimated that the number of active licensed maxi taxis is approximately 5,000. I am aware that the Minister of Works and Transport, together with the Transport Commissioner, are finalizing the records at this time, and I'm told by this afternoon they'll know the exact number, but the number they've given me is approximately 5,000.
Senator Mark.
Can I ask the Honourable Minister if he can clarify or share with us the distribution of this grant? Is it going to be the owners / drivers, or is it going to be directly at the owners of the maxi taxis? Could you clarify that for us? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The precise details are being worked out at present, but the grant is intended for the taxi itself, the maxi taxi itself, so that the Ministry of Works and Transport will come to a final determination as to whether the grant will be given to the owners, the operators, and so on. That is being finalized at this time, but the purpose is to ensure that the grant is for the vehicle itself.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Minister of Finance, can the Minister advise as to how soon government intends to commence distribution of the 2,000 fuel support grant for maxi taxis?
Minister of Finance.
Very much, Madam President. I'm pleased to announce that the funds are available. The Ministry of Finance has the funds ready to disburse to the Ministry of Works and Transport. And once the two questions that I've just raised as to whether it should be a check or whether it should be a fuel card and whether it should be given to the owners, the operators, etc., are resolved, which I expect to be resolved by tomorrow, the process of obtaining the funds and making arrangements for the disbursement can take place. I would estimate, barring unforeseen circumstances, that these grants can be made available at some point in time next week.
Senator Mark.
Honourable Minister, would you wish to advise us, that is the Senate, through the President, whether you anticipate the 5,000 or so owners / operators of maxi taxis would have in their possession no later than next week those checks, or as you indicated, whether it is a fuel card? Would you be able to clarify and guide us when they will actually receive the cards, the cash, the fuel?
Senator Mark, you're repeating the question.
Yes.
But I will ask the Minister to respond.
And I will repeat the answer, Madam President. Barring unforeseen circumstances, I would expect that the grants will be distributed next week.
Thank you very much. We will now revert to the business of the Senate that was in progress. Senator Obika.
Thank you, Madam President. I am grateful for the opportunity to join the debate on a topic that would reach not only the hearts of all, but also the plates of many who are involved in the food chain regarding our animals in Trinidad and Tobago. The reality is there are some issues with the bill. Senator Mark raised some key issues, and I don't want to drill into the clauses of the bill that speaks to some unfettered powers of the inspector. And before I continue, I want to join in this House in welcoming a Southerner like myself, who actually is from the constituency of Point 14 like myself, from Erin, Senator Jason Williams. So there are about 10 issues that I wish to raise. One has to do with reporting of issues. I see that there's an inclusion in terms of circulation online when there are announcements by the inspector and so on, and the minister. I want to strengthen and deepen that to create more sufficient communication with the public so you get critical mass. I want to look at the unfettered powers of the inspector in certain aspects of the law, issues regarding arrival notification and denial of entry of animals by persons who are involved in importation for commerce or personal reasons, the issue of quarantine and the facilities that the state has at its disposal, as well as the state of the roads, because that is mentioned again in terms of one of the offenses, the short period for destroying or terminating animals if they are not claimed. And then I find that the bill does not provide significant options for alternatives in sentencing so that you have the ability to rehabilitate persons who may run afoul of some offenses that this legislation focuses on. And then, of course, I will start with a disturbing clause regarding the right of appeal to the inspector, and I feel that we should get some more clarity there, because Section 21G establishes the right of appeal to the inspector within 7 days for any person aggrieved. And if such a person still remains aggrieved, they can proceed to the High Court. My issue is if the inspector's office may be the party that is causing pain for a citizen or an actor in this economic value chain regarding animals, or excuse me, then it becomes very difficult to accept that the inspector may be the body that would host the tribunal, because then the inspector may become a judge in his or her own cause. I think we need to get some level of comfort regarding how that will be administered. That is difficult for me, and I think that is one of the most dangerous aspects of this law, given the severity of the sanctions, the punishment, and the increasing of the fines and jail term from 5,000 to 50,000 and so on. I think we should really balance that with fettering some of these powers. The inspector shouldn't have such a free hand. So now let's go through the bill in its clauses. New Section 5A speaks to establishment when there is an invasive alien animal species, it's imperative for notification. To a veterinary officer. The question is there any association of veterinary officers in Trinidad and Tobago? And if not, if so, if it would be expedient to the law to mention that in the legislation. And if there is not one, if the minister may wish to recommend such a body be formed so that it can give some focus to the legislation, because it speaks to many times a veterinarian. There is the post of a chief veterinary officer, but that is a state post. But there is no association of veterinarians so that we can get the information circulated to them in a way that facilitates public education, because the veterinarians would be the custodians of public education at the local level when persons carry their animals, whether they be farm animals or whether they be personal pets, to the vet. Then we move on to new Section 5E, which presents, in the case of an emergency, the format with which the state must follow to inform the population via the inspector. And I want to focus again, I see here the Gazette which most citizens do not read or are not even aware that it exists. 2 daily newspapers circulating in Trinidad and Tobago, and with due respect to the main newspapers in this country, most persons get their news via online sources. So I see that electronic media is included, and I would wonder if the drafters of the bill would want to include some measure of critical mass, to indicate maybe, because it's easier to say if you pick between Guardian, Express, and Newsday that you have some level of circulation. But it's a little more difficult if you just say online media. So if you can say online media with a reach of, let's say, 20% of the population, so you get a level of critical mass being informed. So that it's not informed by the amount of electronic media outlets you use, but the amount of recipients that benefit from the information, so it can be spread across the population. Then we move on to was making a similar observation regarding import requirements, where the requirement is published via the Gazette and its website, that is the inspector. And I made a similar request for if there can't be any association of veterinarians, so that the information is properly disseminated to those who would inform the public at the local levels. If we move on to, I'm minded of the 20 minutes time, so it's not available to me to develop much of these points at length. So there's an issue regarding new section 16A, as far as I sit. It says here that the inspector can also prohibit the importation of any item which, in the officer's opinion, is capable of carrying any notifiable infectious or contagious diseases affecting animals. So therefore, it may have nothing to do specifically with an animal. It may simply be regarding gear, rope, sling, a box, crate, a tank, aquarium, all these things that are listed here. And it begs the question, what is the opportunity for justice at the level of a tribunal, swift justice at the level of a tribunal, that balances this unfettered power within the inspector's office with the rights of citizens and the speed at which we need business to function? All right, because we can very well imagine that someone bringing in a large aquarium, a box, a crate, and so on, for a business that involves animals would be doing so on a timely basis. So if you can't get the aquarium, then that will affect the ability for you to bring in the actual fish, for example. So if you're in tilapia farming, for instance, and there are many cooperatives that were looking towards that avenue, and there are many persons in Trinidad and Tobago looking towards that aspect of farm production. So it will be important for this tribunal that is not mentioned to be created, and then we could inspect exactly what would be the powers of this inspector. But as far as I see it, if I were to be advising a client in this industry, then you would have to be wary of which side of the bed, proverbially, the inspector wakes up on when you're importing items, because that can affect your ability to actually bring in something or not, because it's after the inspector, there's nothing else. Then we go on to arrival notification. So as you continue along the value chain in the business of importation of animals, which is important, you can well imagine in a country like Trinidad and Tobago where much of our meat is imported, much of our dairy products requires the importation of the animals, the feed, and the equipment. So under new section 16C, it provides that any customs officer, importer, courier, master of a vessel, or captain of an aircraft must promptly notify the inspector of the arrival of any animals, carcasses, animal product, or animal-related items. And when we turn to the bill, under the definition clauses, animal-related items includes, well, of course, the carcass, genetic material, animal parts. But it also goes beyond that to feed, litter, and any packaging, container, equipment, or other appliances used on animals, objects or material capable of harboring or spreading animal diseases. So whilst we are mindful that this bill seeks to protect our space from the spread of dangerous animal diseases that can also devastate our livestock here, but also can cause animal to human spread, we should also be mindful that the decisions therein can affect the ability for many businesses to function. And we really need to balance these clauses here. They could be very damaging to businesses. And when you have the ability of any customs officer or anyone that is along that supply chain to stop the flow, it can really damage business. And we need to be able to respond at the speed of business in the event that the importer is actually in the right and that they were wrongfully stopped. Now, this goes on to new section 16E, where a veterinary officer at any port of entry, and this is the part that is important, if the health certificate issued by the inspector of the exporting country is incomplete. Now, how far are we going to take that? How much discretion are we going to allow the veterinary officer to exercise? As we say in Trinidad, how much leeway we're going to give them? Because to me, just leaving the word incomplete alone could be dangerous. Would we want to couch the language in such a way that, as opposed to just saying incomplete, but to the effect that the items that are imported could be potentially dangerous given the tenets of the law. If it was incomplete, but it omitted something that may not be materially dangerous in terms of infectious diseases and so on, I think we should be able to massage the language to facilitate that. If not, that again brings a stronger and additional case for the need for a tribunal that balances these powers that are basically stacked against importers. Then we go on to clause 25 regarding quarantine of animals. Now, clause 25 of the bill seeks to amend section 18 of the Act by repealing the existing section, which provides for all imported animals. Now, the question that is begged here is, where would these animals be quarantined? Are we going to have the phenomenon of self-quarantine existing? Or would it be at a state facility? And then, of course, that begs the question as to the capacity.
Senator Obika, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And that begs the question as to the capacity at the level of the state to be able to house and to maintain the proper health of these animals. And when you can imagine that an importer may be engaged in a transaction that is $100,000 or $5 million, depending on what animals and what quantity they may be bringing in with a particular shipment, the inability for safe quarantine facilities to be made available to these persons for their animals can actually damage their entire business model. And that would increase significantly the business risk and, of course, the ability or inability of the persons in the sector, the wider sector, to be able to get financing for similar ventures. So we must take these things into consideration. There's another clause on the prohibition of maltreatment, new section 18A, where it says that the the condition of the road traveled. If there's an issue by the inspector of the condition of the road that the animal has traveled, then they have committed an offense. Are we now blaming the farmers or individual citizens in this country for the state of the nation's roads, which are deplorable in many places, especially in rural areas? I mean, we need to be careful where we put this as an offense, because then again, it shouldn't be an offense that is borne by the citizens, when their taxes should cover the state of the roads. New Section 18G speaks to a very short time period in which the state can destroy or terminate persons, animals, or livestock. And I think there's a 7-day circulation again in just Gazette and newspapers, no mention of online circulation, and then 48 hours thereof. So this, again, only speaking to print media and Gazette is archaic. It needs to go wider than that. And again, the time period is a bit too short for my comfort. Section 21.1, and this caught my attention because the minister spoke to this in a media briefing that preluded this debate. And it speaks to the offense's significant fines in the tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, for a wide range of offenses. But there is no avenue for rehabilitation. If someone harms an animal and then they are caused to pay severe fines or face imprisonment, are we to believe that this person will now be an animal lover? I beg to differ. I think what we should do is explore the avenue of rehabilitation where persons can become animal lovers in Trinidad and Tobago. Jailing someone for mistreating an animal may actually make them become more cruel and inhumane in their treatment of animals. So these are the points I have on this bill. It gives too much unfettered powers to the inspector. We need to have teeth in the form of a tribunal. And finally, jailing persons and with heavy fines may not always be the solution. We should look at rehabilitation, so some alternative to desentencing. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Honourable Senators, I wish at this stage to revert to the earlier item on the order paper. I am now in receipt of the instrument. To Mr. Damian Anthony Lyder, whereas Senator Anita Haynes is incapable of performing her duties as a senator by reason of illness. Now, therefore, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(b) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, acting in accordance with the advice of the Leader of the Opposition, do hereby appoint you, Damian Anthony Lyder, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 19th of May, 2020, and continuing during the absence from the Senate of Senator Anita Haynes by reason of illness. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's, this 19th day of May, 2020. Honourable Senators, a senator is required to take the oath.
I, Damian Lyder, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the duties, the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Honourable Senators, at this juncture, the sitting will be suspended and we will return at 1:45 p.m. So the sitting is suspended until 1:45 p.m.